Chapter 24. Daniel's brain struggled to process the numerous inputs that assaulted it: the deafening thunder, the burning heat, the blinding light. The floor shook as flames consumed the walls and the roof started caving in. They were lucky to be alive, as the worst effects of the explosion were kept from them by an ad hoc protective barrier, but they were far from safe. "Hold on!" Anna gestured downward, and the floor they were standing on broke off and rose into the air. Daniel stumbled as he tried to keep his feet, and she pulled him in close, balancing for them both. She guided their platform into a rapid ascent through a freshly made hole in the ceiling. Seconds after they cleared the roof of the assembly plant, the building shook from another blast and collapsed into a pile of fire and twisted metal. No MMD barrier would have protected them from that. As Daniel's eyes adjusted to the daylight, the military gunship hovering above them answered one of their questions. Smoke dissipated in the air around the missile launchers that had fired on the assembly plant. "Watch out!" Local comms were still online, evident by the warning Lisa screamed through the data lens. The gunship's enormous flux bolt emitters shifted toward them. Anna's hands sprang into action and their platform darted away. "You'll have to stop the bolts. I'm focusing on flying." "I'm on it." He wavered as he tried to keep his footing while preparing to deflect incoming attacks. In theory, he understood how the program worked and the right gestures to make, but if he got the timing wrong, the consequences would be fatal. The gunship opened fire, and he responded with a hasty wave of his wrist that sent the flux bolt veering away from them. Another burst of energy streaked at them a half-second later, and once again he deflected it. His ears pounded with rushing blood every time a shot was fired. Anna's face screwed up as she navigated them through the air, still gripping him tightly with one hand. "We're sitting ducks up here. I have to get us to the ground." Daniel looked down, dizzied by the height, and continued to listen for the sound of more weapons fire. His stomach churned as they began a descent so quick that it felt like falling. Adding to the sensory overload, Jada shouted through the comms. "Zhao!" The touch of fear in her voice stunned him. He hadn't believed Jada could have fear. Then his mind parsed the word and recognized its significance. Zhao was here. Anna slowed for a landing, then leapt off the platform and dragged him with her. Daniel allowed himself to be pulled along while he looked up at the gunship, recoiling at the sight of Zhao hovering in the sky, held aloft by nothing. Dressed in a black combat suit with two curved swords hanging off her belt, she steadied herself with two outstretched arms as she floated down gracefully. Noting a bulky pack strapped to her back, Daniel realized it wasn't a portable matter container as they had assumed. It was her non-failsafe MMD. Agents and soldiers often wore special armor to fly, using MMDs to manipulate the substantial outer shells and move through the air. The light, form-fitting clothes that Zhao had on weren't designed for that. Her backpack allowed her to fly by manipulating the particles in her body directly, a maneuver which demonstrated her lack of a failsafe and was clearly intended to terrify her enemies. In Daniel's case, it worked. Behind Zhao, the gunship drifted toward the ground, a handful of soldiers visible through its open sides. They were dressed similar to Zhao, not in military fatigues, but black bodysuits. "We need to move!" Anna let go of Daniel's hand and dashed forward to join the other agents. His momentary stupor broken, he ran after her, arriving just in time to see Guerrero's shock at the sight of his wife. "Agent Flynn, what are you doing here?" Anna waved a dismissive hand. "Later." He knew the tone well. She wouldn't suffer anything that wasn't addressing the threat in the sky. Jada, Lisa, Ward, and another agent he didn't know stood beside Guerrero. The soldiers and plant workers they'd arrested before Zhao's arrival sat bound in restraints in the nearby agency hovercar, peering up hopefully as she floated down like a messiah coming to rescue them. She'd pulled the swords off her hips and held one in each hand, letting the weapons fall in front of her, crossed at her knees. Her cold, proud expression was that of a woman willing to deal out death. Daniel had only seen pictures of her before, but they hadn't captured what he now saw. Not only confidence, but drive and cruelty. He moved up close to Anna and nudged her. The backpack. She and the others looked at him with questioning eyes, and he pointed up at Zhao. Project Libertas doesn't know how to make non-failsafe MMDs in weapon forms yet, so the swords aren't MMDs. The backpack is what she's using to fly. Anna nodded. That makes sense. Then her eyes registered someone behind him, and she gave a curt nod. Carrie. Daniel half turned to find Yang approaching the group, escorting Suzanne Lewis and 3 others, each haggard from being pent up without sunlight or exercise. Lewis looked nothing like the sharp executive from her picture. Her neat hair now frayed at the edges, and her suit had been replaced by simple gray prison clothes. Carrie had been looking into the sky, but the sound of Anna's voice drew her eyes downward. They widened in surprise. Anna! No time to catch up. We've got work to do. We certainly do. Carrie put an arm out in front of Lewis. Stand back. We'll handle this. Jada took control, directing the agents. Fan out. Don't let them surround us. Anna stepped forward, placing herself in between Daniel and Zhao, and the other agents joined her, forming an arc. Zhao watched their movements with calculating eyes as she alighted gracefully onto the ground. 6 soldiers had already disembarked from the gunship and now moved up behind her, swords drawn. Her eyes scanned the agents, then looked past them to Lewis. Wagging her head, she addressed the executive with a smirk. Suzanne Lewis, it's good to see you. Not giving Lewis a chance to reply, she turned to Jada. It's quite the hubris to believe you could shut down our operation without consequences. Jada didn't flinch. It's my job. Whatever fear Daniel had heard in her voice earlier, she didn't show it now. Before Zhao could say anything else, Guerrero spoke, her voice containing the coldness he remembered from the agency lockup, but this time directed at Zhao. Jennifer Zhao, we've been studying you. A disgraced Marine who gave up on serving her country. Who has your allegiance now? Zhao gave her a patronizing smile. Elaine Guerrero, what a shame to find you here. Maybe the director can salvage this somehow. I know she'd hate to lose you. Guerrero frowned. The director? What are you talking about? Anna hissed at her. Redmond. She works for Redmond. You both have the same boss. Guerrero's frown deepened. I don't understand. Zhao's eyes twinkled as they shifted to Anna. Agent Flynn has it right, the clever woman. She nodded at the assembly plant. I suppose it's thanks to you we've had to destroy all of this. What a waste. Why couldn't you stay in jail like a good little agent? It's not as if we're going to stop. It'll just get a lot messier. Her smile became cruel. But now I can take off the kid gloves and deal with you properly. Redmond can't fault me for what must happen now. Jenny, you're psychotic. This unexpected pronouncement came from behind Daniel. He turned to see Lewis spitting out her words. You always were. Zhao raised her eyebrows in mock astonishment. Oh? You hardly rate as an objective critic, Suzanne, but there was a time your lover agreed with our goals, before he went soft. Lewis shook her head and waved at the structures around them. Darren was never a part of this. He enlisted to protect our way of life. It took some time, but eventually he learned the truth. It's all rotten. Zhao cackled. It's amazing how a man's ideology can change when his taste in women does. Darren was soft then, and he's soft now. Lewis flushed. No, he was never soft, but he did underestimate you. You and Redmond both. He thought you pushed too far, but not that you'd build something like those. She clipped the last word in bitter disdain as she indicated Zhao's weapons. Zhao lifted the sword in her right hand to point its tip at her. This is for our country, to defend against those foreign powers who won't stop innovating just because we do. If we're capable of developing this technology, they are too, and they will. Darren knows this, but he lacks the stomach to do what's necessary. Instead, he turned to treason. The red in Lewis's face gained shades of purple, and her nostrils flared. Treason! We've done no such thing. Zhao matched Lewis's intensity. It's not treason to start an anti-government group. A better way should have been put in jail a long time ago. This is well-earned justice, but it's incomplete until we find your lover. As the argument escalated, Daniel glanced worriedly at Anna and noted her eyes had glazed over. He guessed she was ignoring the conversation in favor of working out the implications of a violent confrontation with Zhao and her soldiers. 5 against 7 and a gunship made for poor odds. Without preamble, Lisa interrupted the back and forth, her manner almost casual. Zhao, I have to admit, it sounds to me like Monk traded up. Suzanne's assessment that you're psychotic? I'm getting that vibe from you. Zhao turned and narrowed her eyes. You're pretty cocky for someone facing down a non-failsafe MMD. You, of all people, should know what I can do. Lisa shrugged. You going to nip my cheek like you did Anna? I've had worse injuries. Remember the time your husband shot me? Despite her light tone, Daniel understood that Lisa meant to provoke Zhao and draw her attention away from Lewis. She didn't have the mod to protect her, so Zhao could do anything to her she wanted, and what Zhao wanted might be terrible if she got angry enough. The plan almost worked. Zhao sneered. I can do more than give you a cut. She began to move at Lisa, but hesitated. Or maybe I should save you for later. Let me settle this score first. She whipped around and flicked her wrist at Lewis. With a sickening crack, the woman's right arm broke just above the elbow, and she yelled out in agony. Falling to the ground, she grabbed at it with her left hand as she writhed in pain. Then, everyone was in motion all at once.
Anna didn't wait for Zhao to act. She dashed at her, noting the other agents doing the same out of the periphery of her eye. The soldiers were also surging forward to meet them, resulting in a convergence on Zhao, who narrowly avoided the melee by lifting herself into the air over the fray. As she flew up, she glared hard at Anna and made a fierce gesture with her arms. A tingle curled around Anna's neck, then died out. Horrified, she realized that Zhao had attempted to break it, but Daniel's mod had saved her. She locked eyes with the floating warrior, unsettled at the brutality, but relishing the surprise that flashed across her assailant's face. A sword slicing through the air shattered the moment, and she brought up her staff just in time to thwart the blow, her mind shifting to combat tactics as agents and soldiers crashed into one another like waves of the ocean. Jada's commanding voice cut through the sounds of battle. Yang, get the prisoners out of here, right now! Carrie disengaged from a tall man with a sword and rushed toward Lewis, who was still on the ground clutching her arm. The soldier began pursuing her, but Anna took a nimble step toward him and aimed a wide sweep of her staff at his chest. He pulled up short, abandoning his quarry to face her as his sword clanged against her staff. She switched stances to take him on even as her original assailant continued her aggression. She spared another glance up at Zhao, who still hovered in the air above them, eyes flashing with anger, not at Anna or the others beneath her, but at Daniel standing by the hovercar. She deduced why her MMD had failed to break Anna's neck and now set her ire on the protective mod's creator. Unfortunately, with two soldiers attacking her, Anna couldn't do anything about it. As she parried two incoming strikes, the crackle of flux bolts rang out from overhead, followed moments later by the pops of Daniel's deflections. Relieved he was able to react in time, Anna placed her full focus on her fierce attackers. The towering man who'd been chasing Carrie was so large that his sword looked like a toy in his hands. The woman was smaller than him, but only slightly. Both were delivering powerful, unrelenting blows, and Anna's arms began to tire at their relentless pace. Taking a risk, she muscled into the man, forcing him to step back and give her space, then turned to engage the woman head-on. After sidestepping a sword thrust, she swung her staff around in a wide arc aimed at the woman's head. Her opponent raised her sword to block the hit, but before the weapons connected, Anna disassembled her staff and instantly reassembled it, allowing it to bypass the sword and maintain momentum. When it cracked into the woman's skull, she crumpled to the ground, unconscious. The man bore down, attempting to take advantage of Anna's momentary change of focus, but she managed to pivot in time to catch his sword and knock it aside. Looking over his shoulder, she saw that Carrie had pulled Lewis to her feet and was now dragging her toward the hovercar, following the other three prisoners who had already fled into it. Jada's voice crackled over their comms. The hovercar is taking off as soon as Lewis is inside. Anna knew she and the other agents wouldn't be able to board. If they tried to retreat, the soldiers would overcome them. But she hoped Daniel would go. He might have handled the first flurry of Zhao's flex bolts, but was inexperienced and would eventually slip up. She needed him to be safe.
Daniel deflected several shots from Zhao before she changed her approach and became a human projectile, diving at him with swords extended to run him through. He quickly erected a wall up out of the earth that caught her strike, her sword still poking through to the other side and almost stabbing him anyway. This only bought him a few seconds, as Zhao soon had it torn down and was advancing on him. He didn't know what to do. With no defense against her, he kept retreating, backing toward the hover car. Even as Zhao prepared to attack, Yang appeared out of nowhere, dragging Lewis by her arm. She shoved the woman into the hover car, then darted in front of Daniel, spinning her staff with a grand flourish. Zhao narrowed her eyes at the agent even as she unleashed a whirlwind of cuts and thrusts with her two swords. Yang artfully countered them all with a strong, practiced technique. Jada's commanding voice rang out. "Daniel, get in here. We're taking off." He felt the back of his calves touch the floorboard of the hovercar and turned to climb in. As soon as he was inside, its doors solidified behind him, instantly muting the clanging and shouts of battle. He grabbed a handhold in the ceiling and the hovercar took off, starting to pick up speed as it flew away from the assembly plant. Looking down through a window, he saw Zhao and Yang still trading blows where he'd been standing moments before. His eyes were drawn to Anna, now engaged with a large man dancing around the body of an unconscious woman. A few feet away, Lisa and Ward fought their own opponents, while the agent he didn't recognize lay sprawled on the ground beside them, either dead or passed out. The remaining two soldiers had abandoned the fight and were headed toward the gunship. A chill ran down Daniel's spine as he realized they were planning to pursue the hovercar. The vehicle shuddered around him as it accelerated, and he shifted away from the window to find Jada and Guerrero standing as he was, gripping handholds that descended from the ceiling. Lewis and the other rescued prisoners sat in the row of chairs nearest him, while the arrested plant workers and guards were secured further back in the hovercar. The soldiers' steely expressions hid their thoughts, but the others, including Lewis, wore various expressions of fright. Too angry to be afraid, Daniel's eyes settled on Guerrero, the woman who had forced them to work in secret, afraid for their lives. "Anna and I were never your enemies." She met his stare and returned her own. "It's not clear to me who my enemies are, but I'm not counting either of you among my allies. Not yet." "You should." They both turned to look at Jada, who nodded at Daniel. "He developed the mod I provided you and the other agents. It counters Zhao's non-failsafe MMDs. Guerrero's eyes widened. "You said our data techs. The gunship is in pursuit." Speaking out of nowhere, Simon's sudden reappearance shocked Daniel. "Simon, you're back?" "The gunship has been jamming signals back to the agency, but we're far enough away that I have been able to re-establish contact with you. If it catches up, we'll lose our connection again." Daniel tensed, and he saw in the faces of the others that they shared his alarm. They weren't worried about access to Simon, but if the gunship overtook them, its attack would be deadly. Jada alone seemed to keep her cool. "How long do we have?" "Approximately 45 seconds. Daniel's mind raced. "We're going to have to let them shoot us down, but our way." Simon was as calm as ever. "What is your plan, Daniel?"
Anna had seen the gunship leave, taking 2 soldiers with it, no doubt in pursuit of the hovercar and Daniel. She couldn't do anything about it, stuck on the ground, withstanding blow after blow from her opponent's sword. He had plenty of power, but lacked finesse, so she focused on countering him with as little effort as possible. He wouldn't be able to do this forever, so she'd win by outlasting him. A scream shattered her zen-like concentration, and she knew what had happened before she even risked a glance in Carrie's direction. Shrinking back from Zhao, terror filled her former partner's face as blood poured from a limp hand flopping uselessly at the end of her arm. One of Zhao's swords had gotten through Carrie's defenses and sliced deep enough to force her to release her staff. Time seemed to slow as Zhao kicked the weapon away, and Anna knew what would come next. Without her weapon, Carrie was completely at her opponent's mercy, and the mercy of a non-failsafe MMD. Anna felt a phantom tingle in her neck as Zhao gestured, and Carrie fell like a broken rag doll. "No!" Rage fueled the primal scream that erupted from Anna's lungs. No longer concerned with stamina, she hammered her opponent with adrenaline-fueled rampaging blows. He was helpless to do anything but repel her attacks with his sword, their roles suddenly reversed as her anger took over. She was only dimly aware that Zhao had taken off into the air again and was now heading for her. She only stopped attacking when the soldier's face contorted in agony and he pitched forward, revealing Lisa behind him. She had taken him unaware while Anna had held his attention. Anna gave her partner a quick nod before her senses detected incoming projectiles. She reacted just in time, flinging herself out of the way as a flurry of flux bolts exploded into the ground where she'd been standing. Rolling to her feet, she prepared to deflect a follow-up burst, but instead found Zhao's 2 swords streaking toward her head. She fell back on her heels and spun her staff upward, knocking them aside. Zhao's momentum carried her into Anna, and the 2 women crashed into the dirt, kicking up a cloud of dust. Anna strove to keep her weapon in hand, mindful that releasing it would mean a fast death. They both rose to their feet, facing off. As they circled one another like wild beasts ready to pounce, Anna surveyed the battlefield. Lucas was out cold, but Lisa had taken out the last of the soldiers, leaving her free to team up against Zhao. Even as Lisa maneuvered into a flanking position, an explosion in the distance gripped Anna's heart, and she gasped with recognition of what it was, a gunship missile exploding. "Daniel!" She shouted his name through her comms as Zhao pounced.
Daniel felt the hovercar shudder as the missile detonated meters from its hull. Now strapped into a chair, he pressed his hands hard into the armrest, Jada and Guerrero doing the same. Despite the violent sound and shaking of the vehicle, the missile had not landed a direct hit, instead striking a defensive countermeasure ejected from the hovercar. Simon had used an onboard MMD to assemble an effect which mimicked how an impact against the hovercar would appear to their pursuers. Daniel had used an onboard MMD to assemble an effect which mimicked how an impact against the hovercar would appear to their pursuers. If he'd done it right, the soldiers in the gunship would believe it had sustained more damage than it actually had. Anna's worried voice echoed in his ears, but he resisted the impulse to respond that he was all right. He didn't want to risk their pursuers cracking their comms and catching wind of their plans. Instead, he gritted his teeth. "Take us down, and make it look good." Making it look good. In another context, Daniel would have laughed at the AI's response, but the stress in his body didn't allow for humor. With nothing to do but hold on and hope that the landing wouldn't be too rough, he tried to force himself to loosen his grip and relax. Ever calm even as the hovercar rapidly fell toward the earth, Jada queried the AI. "Are they still firing on us?" "They are not. The gunship is following our descent, so it appears the ruse was successful." Daniel exhaled a long breath of relief. The first ruse. Guerrero followed his movements as he leaned back into his chair, eyes watchful and apprehensive. "I'm not sure what you're planning." "I'm not going to go over it, because you need to trust me." She pressed her lips together tightly, but didn't utter another word. The hovercar hit the ground hard, tossing everyone inside up against their seatbelts as it scraped across the dirt and rock. Simon had performed the rough landing intentionally in order to appear weak and discourage the gunship from firing on them again. After their forward momentum finally stopped, Daniel unclipped his seatbelt and stood up out of his chair. He heard the sound of their pursuers landing behind them and tensed for another missile that didn't come. He finally accepted they were safe for the moment and queried the AI. "Simon?" But Simon didn't respond, their connection severed as soon as the gunship had caught up to them. Silently, Daniel cursed himself for not taking the opportunity to transmit their evidence from the assembly plant while they had the window of communication. He'd been too distracted with worry about being shot down. Checking the location of the gunship to ensure he could exit unseen, he disassembled the hovercar's left door. Jada caught him by his arm just as he was about to step out. "Did you find it?" He frowned and met her eyes before understanding dawned. "The prototype? Yes, I have it." "Prototype?" Guerrero's watchful eyes furrowed in confusion. Daniel reached back and pulled the tablet out of his pack, waving it in front of her. "Remember this? From the vid, supposedly from Feeney?" Supposedly. Her uncertain repetition of the word was the first chip in her cold armor of distrust. "Supposedly. Your people were the ones in that lab. They developed this tech, which is how Zhao has an MMD without a failsafe." Jada put her hand out. "Daniel, I should take it in case..." He nodded, not wanting her to finish the statement. "Yes, take it. Go." He held it out. "Get out of here. Whatever happens to us, we don't want them to recover it. It's the proof of what they've been doing." She unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up, taking the tablet from him. They both climbed out of the vehicle, but before she could leave, Daniel placed a hand on her shoulder. I can help you. Give me a second, and I'll send you a copy of my concealment mod. She hesitated, turning to face him. Do we have time? Yes, it won't take long. Be careful not to move too close to anyone. It only works at a distance. She nodded gratefully. I will. Thank you. Daniel transferred the mod even as he heard soldiers climbing out of the gunship. It's done. Go. Jada locked eyes with him and whispered, Daniel, you can do this. I should have hired you to work for the agency when you applied. I made a mistake. Daniel tried to come up with a response to this, but she saved him the effort with a quick retreat, shimmering out of existence before he could say anything. Left alone, he engaged his own mod and turned to head toward the gunship. He crept past the end of the hovercar, completely exposed by the flat desert land around them if not for his mod. The soldiers on his left each held a sword ready as they scanned the area. He kept several feet away from them and moved quietly. If they noticed him, he'd be done. He froze in place when the eyes of the soldier nearest to him appeared to rest on the spot where he stood, but after a fearful moment, they moved on. As the men closed in on the hovercar, Daniel circled around them in order to take them from behind, knowing he had to make his move soon. One of the soldiers arrived at the hovercar and gestured to disassemble its door. That they had hacks for an agency vehicle didn't surprise Daniel at all. The side of the hovercar disappeared to reveal Guerrero sitting in her chair, staring blankly out at the pair. Behind her, Lewis and the other prisoners were visible, terror written on their faces. Director Guerrero. The soldier started to speak, but was interrupted as Daniel crossed his bracelets and sent a flux bolt into the center of his back. Unprepared for the sensation of unleashing so much energy, he stumbled even as his target collapsed. This was a mod Daniel had never put on Anna's staff, keeping with the agency's ethos of using defensive weapons. But when prepping for today, he'd added it to his bracelets, knowing that if he ever had to defend himself, he'd never win at hand-to-hand combat. The other soldier spun around and fired his own flux bolt at Daniel, who managed to redirect it into the ground at his feet, but was left with a sinking realization that he'd failed to act fast enough. He'd needed to take both men out with 2 rapid-fire bursts, but the experience of firing the first shot had startled him so that he hadn't gotten the follow-up off before the second man was aware of his presence. The soldier now knew Daniel's location and would be able to detect the subtle distortions of light around him, and he was a far more experienced fighter. The man grinned and advanced. I see you now. His cruel tone belonged to someone who enjoyed inflicting pain. Focused as he was on Daniel, the soldier didn't see Guerrero leap out of her chair, pull a hilt from her waist, and assemble it into a sword as she moved. He began to turn when he sensed the movement behind him, but not in time to prevent the thrust of her blade into the calf of his leg. He shrieked and fell sideways, dropping his weapon as he went down. Everyone underestimates me. Guerrero callously pulled her blade back and studied the man on the ground clutching at his wound. She assembled restraints that flew to his wrists, encircling them, and drew his hands together. After narrowing in disgust, her eyes drifted up to meet Daniel's. It seems I underestimated you as well. Daniel let out a long stream of air, trying to release the tension of the moment, but it wasn't over. We still have the pilot to deal with. We do. She walked toward him, sword swaying slightly at her side. Let's work together on that.